Eleanor's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she stormed into the parlor, her face a mask of barely restrained fury. The whispers among the staff, the stolen glances at Naomi, and the faintest of rumors had all led to this moment. She had seen the signs, the way Naomi's hand often rested protectively over her stomach. "Enough of this nonsense!" Eleanor barked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think I haven't noticed?" "Do you think I'm blind?" Naomi looked up, startled but composed, her hand still clutching the laundry she was folding. "Whose child is it?" Eleanor demanded, her tone icy and sharp. "I want the truth, and I want it now." Naomi hesitated, her calm demeanor only fueling Eleanor's anger. "Don't you dare lie to me." Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip, her composure unraveling. She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. "This is my house, Naomi, and you owe me the truth. Who's the father of that child?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Naomi's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, her quiet strength cutting through Eleanor's rage. "Gabriel is Charles's son," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. Eleanor stumbled back as if struck. The name of her husband, the man she had shared her life with, now tied to the child of the woman she had scorned and mistreated for years. Her chest heaved as the weight of the revelation settled over her. "Do you have any idea what this means for my family? For my reputation?" Eleanor demanded, her voice trembling. Naomi's calm reply was a dagger cloaked in grace. "Gabriel doesn't need your family's name or your wealth. He'll stand strong without you." What secrets could drive a powerful family to its breaking point? Who is Gabriel, and why does his existence threaten to unravel years of lies and silence? What will Eleanor do with the truth now that she can no longer ignore it? Let us know your thoughts. What are you most curious about? Share your guesses and reactions in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our emotional and thought-provoking stories. Each one is told to touch your heart and inspire your soul. Now, let's dive into the gripping details of this unforgettable story. Let the journey begin. The warm glow of the Charleston sun poured over cobblestone streets, casting shadows on ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss. The Whitfield estate, with its towering columns and grand facade, stood at the heart of the affluent district, a symbol of old-world charm and wealth. Yet inside its gilded walls, the air was cold, heavy with unspoken resentments and unmet expectations. Eleanor Whitfield, 35, glided down the grand staircase, her heels clicking on the polished oak floor. Her auburn hair was pinned in an impeccable twist, her emerald dress tailored to perfection, yet no amount of elegance could soften the sharpness in her gaze. She paused at the bottom step, surveying the grand parlor with a mix of pride and dissatisfaction. Eleanor's life was a carefully curated image of Southern gentility. She hosted garden parties, attended charity galas, and upheld the Whitfield family name with the precision of a drill sergeant. But beneath her poised exterior lay a simmering bitterness, born of a void she could neither fill nor ignore. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, as sharp now as it had been during her childhood. "A woman's worth is her ability to create a legacy. Without children, Eleanor, what legacy will you leave?" She tightened her grip on the staircase railing, her knuckles whitening. The disappointment of her barren marriage was an open wound she refused to acknowledge, channeling her frustration into relentless control over her household. Naomi Ellis stepped through the back entrance of the Whitfield estate, her soft-soled shoes silent against the slate floor of the servants' quarters. At 25, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her young age. Her hair, tightly coiled and neatly pinned, framed a face marked by resilience. She clutched a small satchel, its worn edges a testament to years of careful use, and paused to take in her surroundings. The estate was unlike anything Naomi had ever known, a labyrinth of sparkling chandeliers, hand-carved woodwork, and pristine marble. It was a world far removed from the modest bungalow where she'd grown up, raised by her grandmother after losing her parents in a car accident. Her grandmother's words rang in her ears. "Hard work and a steady heart, Naomi. That's how you stand tall." Charles Whitfield had hired her directly, recognizing her determination and efficiency during a brief interview at the local employment agency. She had impressed him with her directness and humility, qualities he rarely encountered in his gilded social circle. But Eleanor's first words to Naomi were anything but welcoming. "Make no mistake," Eleanor said, her voice like a blade slicing through the tension. "I expect perfection. Anything less won't be tolerated." Naomi met Eleanor's cold stare with calm resolve. "Yes, ma'am," she replied simply, knowing better than to engage. By mid-morning, Naomi was scrubbing the estate's marble foyer. The ornate floor sparkled under her diligent care, but sweat beaded on her brow as Eleanor appeared, her eyes scanning for flaws. "You missed a spot," Eleanor said curtly, pointing to an invisible mark on the pristine floor. Naomi straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll take care of it right away, Mrs. Whitfield." Eleanor lingered, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "It's Mrs. Whitfield to you, always. Do not forget your place." "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield," Naomi replied, her tone measured. Eleanor turned and strode away, the faint scent of jasmine trailing in her wake. Naomi exhaled slowly, turning back to her task. She didn't need Eleanor's approval, just the paycheck that would keep her afloat. Charles Whitfield entered the foyer, his presence a quiet contrast to his wife's sharpness. At 38, his features were marked by years of business dealings and long hours, but his dark eyes held a warmth that softened his demeanor. He paused as he watched Naomi work, noting the meticulous care she brought to even the simplest tasks. "You must be Naomi," he said, his tone friendly. Naomi stood, brushing stray curls from her forehead. "Yes, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Whitfield. Charles," he corrected with a small smile. "Welcome to the Whitfield estate. I trust everything is to your liking?" Naomi hesitated before replying. "It's a fine home, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work here." Charles nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. He seemed about to say more, but was interrupted by Eleanor's sharp voice calling from the next room. "Charles, are you coming or not?" His shoulders stiffened, and he offered Naomi a brief nod before turning away. As he left, Naomi couldn't help but notice the tension in his stride, as though he carried the weight of the entire estate on his back. In the weeks that followed, Naomi settled into her role, but the dynamic in the Whitfield household grew increasingly strained. Eleanor's icy demeanor toward Naomi was relentless, her disdain thinly veiled beneath the guise of professionalism. One afternoon, Naomi overheard Eleanor speaking to a guest during a garden party. "She's competent, I suppose, but you know how they can be. One has to keep a firm hand." Naomi's cheeks burned, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that dignity was best preserved through silence. The Whitfield estate was cloaked in silence that evening, save for the gentle hum of the ceiling fans slicing through the humid Charleston air. Naomi moved quietly through the hallways, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floors. In her hands, she balanced a tray with a steaming cup of coffee and a neatly folded napkin. Charles Whitfield's study loomed ahead, the faint glow of a desk lamp spilling through the half-open door. She paused, adjusted her apron, and knocked softly. "Come in," came the deep, familiar voice. Naomi entered, the tray steady in her hands. Charles looked up from a sea of documents, his face etched with the exhaustion of a long day. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and a furrow ran deep across his brow. "Coffee, Mr. Whitfield," she said, placing the tray on the desk. Charles offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Naomi. You didn't have to." "It's no trouble," she replied, stepping back with her hands clasped neatly in front of her. For a moment he stared at the cup, as if lost in thought. Then, almost impulsively, he spoke. "Naomi, can I ask you something?" "Yes, sir." "Where does someone like you find patience to face life's demands without letting it weigh you down?" Naomi blinked, startled by the question. She considered her words carefully. "My grandmother used to say, 'Du kono jiao, kon fai song voi long tu trong va su tu te.' It means, wherever you are, you must live with dignity and kindness." She raised me after my parents passed, and her words have stayed with me. Charles leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Your parents? They passed when you were young?" She nodded. "A car accident. I was 6. My grandmother took me in, worked long hours as a seamstress to make sure I never went without. She was the strongest woman I've ever known." Charles was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "I lost my father young too. My mother, she loved us, I suppose, but she was always so consumed with maintaining appearances. It felt like the family name mattered more than the people in it." Naomi met his eyes, and for the first time she saw not a wealthy employer, but a man carrying a weight he didn't know how to set down. "That sounds lonely," she said softly. "It is," Charles admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase, her gaze sharp as she watched Naomi emerge from Charles's study. The sight of her husband sharing even a moment of conversation with the young housemaid sent a ripple of unease through her. By the time dinner was served, Eleanor's unease had simmered into irritation. She sat at the head of the table, her posture impeccable, her every movement calculated. Across from her, Charles toyed with his fork, barely touching his food. Naomi moved quietly around the room, refilling glasses and clearing plates. Eleanor's eyes followed her every move, calculating, waiting. Finally, she broke the silence. "Naomi," Eleanor said, her tone cool. "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield?" "I've been meaning to ask. Do you find your work here challenging, or do you have aspirations beyond your station?" Naomi paused for only a fraction of a second before replying, her voice steady. "I believe every job is important if it's done with care and respect, ma'am." Eleanor's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A commendable attitude. But let me offer some advice. People like you should focus on excelling at what you're given, not dreaming of what you'll never have." Naomi's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the pitcher she held. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, grounding her. She drew a breath and replied, "I've always believed that hard work deserves respect, Mrs. Whitfield. I do my best to live by that." Charles looked up from his untouched plate, his brow furrowing at Eleanor's pointed tone. But Eleanor, satisfied with her veiled insult, returned to her meal as if nothing had happened. Later that night, Naomi sat on the edge of her modest bed in the servants' quarters. The walls were bare, save for a small framed photograph of her parents and grandmother. She traced the edge of the frame with her fingers, her thoughts lingering on the dinner table confrontation. Her grandmother's voice rang in her ears. "Stand tall, Naomi. Dignity isn't given. It's something you claim for yourself." Naomi whispered a quiet prayer for strength, her hands clasped tightly together. She wasn't here to win Eleanor's approval or to seek pity. She was here to work, to build a future, and to honor the sacrifices of those who had come before her. Across the estate, Charles stood by the window of his study, staring out into the dark expanse of the garden. He couldn't shake the image of Naomi, standing resolute under Eleanor's withering scrutiny. He thought about their conversation earlier, about the calm dignity with which Naomi had spoken of her past. It was a quality he rarely saw in his social circle, where appearances were valued over authenticity. Charles sighed, running a hand through his hair. He felt a pang of guilt for the life he was leading, a life bound by expectations and appearances, devoid of the warmth and honesty he so desperately craved. For a fleeting moment, he wondered what it would feel like to break free from it all. The dynamic within the Whitfield household was shifting, though no one dared to acknowledge it. Eleanor's sharp glances grew more frequent, her tone more clipped. Charles found himself retreating more often to his study, seeking solace in the quiet moments Naomi's presence provided. And Naomi? She continued to move through the estate with quiet grace, carrying the weight of her responsibilities and the whispers of her grandmother's wisdom. Unbeknownst to her, she was becoming the axis on which the delicate balance of the Whitfield household turned, a balance that was growing increasingly fragile with each passing day. The stillness of the night blanketed the Whitfield estate as Naomi sat in her modest room in the servants' quarters. The faint hum of crickets outside the small window was the only sound accompanying her thoughts. She held a small framed photograph in her hands, the worn edges a testament to how often she had clung to it for comfort. The image depicted her younger self nestled between her parents, their faces radiating warmth and hope, and her grandmother standing proudly behind them. Naomi ran her fingers over the photograph, her thumb brushing against her grandmother's face. The memories of their small house in the outskirts of Charleston, a place filled with the smell of fresh cornbread and the hum of gospel songs, came rushing back like the tide. Naomi's childhood home was a modest bungalow, the paint peeling slightly on the edges, but it was a place bursting with love. Her grandmother, Evelyn Ellis, was a formidable woman with calloused hands from years of stitching quilts for the local community. Despite the struggles, Evelyn had always ensured that Naomi felt cherished and safe. Naomi remembered the mornings spent on the porch, her grandmother's voice strong and steady as she spoke life lessons that Naomi would carry forever. "Life won't hand you anything easy, Naomi," her grandmother would say, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "But don't let the hard times steal your pride or your kindness. Keep your head high, no matter what." As a child, Naomi didn't fully understand the weight of those words. But now, sitting in her small room at the Whitfield estate, they resonated with a clarity that made her chest tighten. Her parents had been everything to her, a source of warmth and laughter. But at 6 years old, she had lost them both in a tragic car accident. The world had shifted for her that day, plunging her into a darkness she didn't know how to navigate. Her grandmother had stepped in without hesitation, her strength and resilience becoming a guiding light for Naomi. Evelyn had taught her how to stand tall in the face of judgment, how to value hard work, and how to treat others with respect, even when they didn't offer the same in return. Naomi closed her eyes and saw her grandmother in the kitchen, humming softly as she kneaded dough. "Always remember, child," Evelyn had said, "the world might not see your worth, but as long as you do, that's enough." Naomi looked at the photograph again, her heart heavy with longing. She whispered softly to the image, her voice barely audible. "I miss you both so much. I hope I'm making you proud." She set the frame on the small wooden table beside her bed and folded her hands in her lap. The weight of her family's sacrifices pressed against her, but it also fueled her determination. "Con se kong je cha me phai that vong," she murmured in Vietnamese, the language her grandmother had used to soothe her during the darkest times. The memories shifted to when she was 18 and had taken her first job as a cashier at a local grocery store. She'd been nervous, standing behind the register, fumbling with the buttons under the watchful eyes of impatient customers. But her grandmother had been there to reassure her. "Every great journey starts with one small step," Evelyn had said, squeezing Naomi's hand. "You'll figure it out." And Naomi had. She learned to manage the register, greet customers with a smile, and handle the occasional rudeness with grace. Those early lessons in resilience shaped her, preparing her for the challenges she would later face. A sharp knock at the door pulled Naomi from her thoughts. She quickly wiped at her eyes, ensuring no trace of emotion lingered as she opened it. It was Maria, one of the older maids, holding a folded stack of linens. "Thought you might need these," Maria said, her voice kind but wary. "Thank you," Naomi replied, taking the linens and placing them on the bed. Maria lingered for a moment. "You're holding up well," she said, glancing around the small room. "Better than most of us did when we started here." Naomi offered a faint smile. "I've had a lot of practice." Maria nodded, but her gaze softened. "Keep your head up. People like us don't get it easy in places like this." "I know," Naomi said, her voice steady, "but I wasn't raised to back down." Maria's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Your grandmother must have been a remarkable woman." "She was," Naomi said quietly, her heart swelling with pride and longing. Later that evening, Naomi moved through the dining room, clearing plates and refilling glasses as the Whitfields hosted a small dinner. Eleanor's sharp eyes followed her every move, her posture stiff with suspicion. As Naomi leaned to pick up an empty plate, Eleanor's voice sliced through the conversation. "Naomi," she said, her tone cool and measured, "it's impressive how diligently you work. I suppose that's something you were taught, growing up?" Naomi straightened, holding the plate steady in her hands. "Yes, Ma'am," she replied, her voice calm. "My grandmother believed hard work was the cornerstone of a good life." Eleanor's smile was icy. "How quaint. I imagine that philosophy serves you well in your position." Naomi met Eleanor's gaze, her face unreadable. "It does, Mrs. Whitfield, and I believe it serves well in any position." Charles, seated across the table, glanced between the two women, his brow furrowing. But Eleanor simply turned back to her conversation, dismissing Naomi with a wave of her hand. As the night wore on, Naomi found herself alone again in her room. She sat at the edge of her bed, the photograph still within reach. Closing her eyes, she whispered a prayer, not for relief from her struggles, but for the strength to endure them. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, as steady and unwavering as ever. "Keep your dignity, Naomi. No one can take that from you unless you let them." Naomi opened her eyes, her resolve hardening like steel. She would not let Eleanor's disdain break her spirit. She would not let the challenges of the Whitfield estate define her. She had a legacy to honor and a promise to keep. The storm descended without warning, drenching the Whitfield estate in sheets of rain. Lightning illuminated the garden in brief, jagged flashes, casting eerie shadows across the grounds. Naomi was outside, battling the wind as she worked to secure the furniture on the patio. She struggled against the storm's fury, her hands slipping on the soaked wood as rain lashed her face. The wind howled, slamming a chair into Naomi's shin with brutal force. She cried out, collapsing onto the wet stone as pain radiated through her leg. Clutching her injury, she tried to stand, but the sharp sting forced her back down. Inside the house, Charles heard the commotion from his study. He peered through the window, his brow furrowing when he spotted Naomi on the ground. Without hesitation, he grabbed an umbrella and rushed outside. "Naomi!" he called over the storm, his voice cutting through the chaos. She looked up, rain streaming down her face. "I'm fine, Mr. Whitfield," she insisted, attempting to rise again. "You're clearly not fine," Charles countered, reaching her side. His strong grip helped her to her feet. "Come inside before you get sick." "I need to finish." "No arguments," he interrupted firmly. "That's an order." Back inside, Charles led Naomi to the kitchen. the warmth of the house a sharp contrast to the storm's cold wrath. He pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. "Let me see," he said, his tone softening. Naomi hesitated, but the pain in her leg overruled her pride. She rolled up her pant leg, revealing an angry bruise already forming on her shin. Charles winced at the sight. "You should have called for help," he said, fetching a first aid kit from a nearby cabinet. "I didn't want to trouble anyone," Naomi replied. "It's my job to take care of things like this." Charles shook his head, kneeling in front of her. "You don't need to do everything alone, Naomi. Sometimes it's okay to ask for help." She watched him work, his hands surprisingly gentle as he applied a cold compress to the bruise. His closeness felt strangely intimate, and she found herself lowering her guard. "Thank you," she said quietly. Charles looked up, meeting her gaze. "You work so hard, always carrying more than your share. Why?" Naomi hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something in his eyes, curiosity mixed with sincerity, made her answer. "I was raised to stand on my own. My grandmother used to say, 'Strength isn't about never needing help. It's about knowing when to accept it.'" Charles smiled faintly. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Naomi replied, her voice tinged with nostalgia. For a moment, silence enveloped them. The storm raged on outside, but within the kitchen, the world seemed to hold its breath. A few days later, the estate bustled with activity as Eleanor hosted one of her lavish banquets. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits filled the grand ballroom, their laughter and conversation echoing through the halls. Eleanor floated among them, a perfect hostess, her smile practiced and polished. Charles, however, stood on the sidelines, nursing a glass of bourbon. The crowd felt suffocating, each conversation superficial and draining. He glanced around, searching for a reprieve, when his eyes landed on Naomi, who was quietly arranging trays in the corner. She caught his gaze and offered a small, polite smile. Later that evening, Charles slipped away from the party, finding solace on the balcony. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the heat and noise inside. He leaned against the railing, gazing out at the garden below. "Mr. Whitfield?" He turned to see Naomi standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Naomi," he said, straightening, "you don't need to call me that when it's just us. It's Charles." She stepped closer, unsure if she was intruding. "You looked like you needed some company." Charles chuckled softly. "Is it that obvious?" Naomi smiled faintly. "A little." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant hum of the party drifted through the open doors, but out here, it was quiet. Charles broke the silence. "I don't know why, but I feel like a stranger in my own home sometimes." Naomi's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "Maybe it's not the home," she said gently. "Maybe it's the people in it. What you need might not be perfection, but someone who truly listens." Charles turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You listen, Naomi." Her breath hitched at the weight of his words. "It's my job to listen," she replied softly, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. "No," he said, stepping closer. "It's more than that. You see people for who they are, not just what they can do for you. That's rare." The air between them thickened, charged with an unspoken connection. Naomi took a step back, her heart pounding. "I should get back inside," she murmured. Charles reached for her hand, stopping her. "Naomi." She turned, her eyes searching his. This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he admitted, "but for the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe when I'm around you." Naomi hesitated, torn between the pull of his words and the weight of their implications. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. I won't. Charles released her hand, regret and longing flashing across his face. I'm sorry, he said, stepping back. Naomi nodded, her composure slipping as she turned and hurried back inside. That night, as the storm of emotions raged within her, Naomi sat in her room, replaying the moment on the balcony. She pressed her hands to her face, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind. Keep your dignity, Naomi. No one can take it from you unless you give it away. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now, not ever. In the quiet of his study, Charles stared at his empty glass, his mind clouded with guilt. He had crossed a line, one that he couldn't uncross. And Eleanor, oblivious to the storm brewing within her home, continued to shine as the perfect hostess, unaware that the foundations of her carefully curated world were beginning to crack. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the Whitfield estate, but inside its ornate walls, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Eleanor's sharp gaze swept over the dining room as she nursed her morning tea. The household staff moved quietly, performing their duties with precision, but Eleanor's attention was fixed on Naomi. Naomi moved slower than usual, a hand unconsciously brushing her abdomen as she carried a tray of dishes. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, suspicion gnawing at her. Something was off, and Eleanor's mind, ever quick to find fault, began piecing together observations she had dismissed before. Eleanor had long prided herself on her ability to detect deceit. It was a skill she had honed in Charleston's social circles, where smiles were often masks and compliments held hidden barbs. She replayed the past weeks in her mind, Charles's growing distance, his stolen glances at Naomi, and now Naomi's subtle changes. Could it be? Eleanor murmured to herself, her teacup rattling slightly as she set it down. Her suspicion hardened into certainty. Rising from her seat, she made her way to the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Naomi was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing a stubborn stain from a pot. She didn't hear Eleanor enter until the unmistakable sound of heels stopped just behind her. "Naomi," Eleanor said, her tone deceptively calm. Naomi straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield?" Eleanor's smile was tight, her eyes cold. "There's something I need to ask you, and I expect complete honesty." Naomi nodded, her stomach tightening. "Of course." Eleanor's gaze dropped to Naomi's midsection before snapping back to her face. "Are you pregnant?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Naomi's breath caught, but she quickly composed herself. "Mrs. Whitfield, I don't think that's an appropriate question," Naomi replied, her voice steady but tinged with defiance. Eleanor's smile vanished. "Inappropriate. You work in my house, under my roof. I have every right to know if my staff's personal affairs might affect their duties." Naomi held her ground, her eyes unwavering. "With respect, my personal life does not interfere with my work." Eleanor's patience snapped. "Don't play coy with me, Naomi. I have eyes. I see how you've been acting, how Charles has been acting. Tell me the truth. Is the child his?" Naomi's heart pounded, but she refused to let Eleanor see her falter. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitfield, but I won't entertain baseless accusations." Eleanor's expression twisted into one of fury. "Baseless? You think I don't see what's happening? You think I'm blind to your little schemes?" Naomi stepped back, her hands trembling at her sides. "I've done nothing wrong, Mrs. Whitfield." Eleanor stormed out of the kitchen, her anger boiling over. She marched into the main hall, where several staff members were tidying up after breakfast. Naomi followed, hoping to de-escalate the situation, but Eleanor spun on her heels, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Everyone, stop what you're doing," Eleanor commanded, her voice loud and commanding. The staff froze, their eyes darting between Eleanor and Naomi. "I have something to say about our dear Naomi," Eleanor began, her tone dripping with venom. "It seems she's been hiding something from us all, a secret that she thinks she can keep. But let me make one thing clear. I will not tolerate deceit in my house." Naomi's cheeks burned as all eyes turned to her. "Mrs. Whitfield, please." "Silence," Eleanor barked. "You've been nothing but a snake in the grass, taking advantage of our generosity. And now you have the audacity to carry on with God knows what shameful behavior under this roof?" The room was thick with tension, the staff too stunned to intervene. Naomi straightened, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "I have served this household with integrity, and I refuse to let you tarnish my name with false accusations." Eleanor laughed coldly. "Integrity? You dare speak of integrity while you parade around like a victim? You are nothing more than a... Enough." The single word came from Charles, who had appeared in the doorway. His voice was calm, but the authority in it silenced the room. He stepped forward, his eyes locking with Eleanor's. "That's enough, Eleanor," he repeated, his tone firmer. "This isn't how we treat people." Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. "You're defending her, after everything?" "I'm defending decency," Charles replied. "You're out of line." But Eleanor wasn't ready to back down. "If you won't deal with her, I will. Naomi, pack your things. You're no longer welcome here." The words landed like a blow, but Naomi refused to crumble. She nodded once, her chin held high, and walked out of the hall without another word. As she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, tears threatened to spill, but she forced them back. This wasn't the first time she'd been unjustly treated, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Charles appeared in the doorway, his expression conflicted. "Naomi," he said softly. She turned to face him, her eyes calm but resolute. "Don't, Mr. Whitfield. There's nothing to say." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with regret. Naomi hesitated before replying. "You don't need to apologize. This was never my home." With that, she picked up her suitcase and walked out of the estate, leaving behind the grandeur and the pain it had brought. Eleanor stood by the window, watching Naomi's figure disappear down the driveway. The satisfaction she'd expected never came. Instead, an uneasy silence settled over her, as if she had torn apart something she couldn't fix. Charles passed her without a word, heading to his study. His silence was louder than any argument, and it left Eleanor alone with her thoughts and her doubts. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Whitfield dining room, casting long golden shadows on the polished floor. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her delicate fingers wrapped around a porcelain teacup. Her gaze was sharp, her posture rigid as she watched Naomi quietly move through the room, collecting empty plates from the breakfast service. Eleanor had always prided herself on noticing the smallest details. It was, after all, what set her apart as the perfect hostess. But now, those same eyes, trained to detect imperfection, lingered on Naomi with a growing sense of unease. Naomi's movements seemed slower, more deliberate. Her posture, once upright and determined, carried a subtle heaviness. Eleanor's lips tightened. She'd noticed the faint flush on Naomi's cheeks lately, the way she occasionally placed a hand on her lower abdomen, almost instinctively. "Naomi?" Eleanor called abruptly, her voice slicing through the quiet. Naomi paused, holding a stack of plates. "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield?" Eleanor's smile was tight, her tone laced with false sweetness. "Are you feeling well? You seem distracted these days." Naomi's eyes flickered with hesitation. "I'm fine, Ma'am. Just a little tired." "Tired?" Eleanor repeated, her sharp gaze narrowing. "Perhaps you've taken on more than you can handle. If that's the case, I'm sure we can find someone more suited to the demands of this household." Naomi's grip on the plates tightened. but her expression remained neutral. "I'm managing just fine, Mrs. Whitfield." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the corner of her mouth curling into a smirk. "Let's hope so. I wouldn't want anyone here, hiding anything." Eleanor's suspicions grew over the next few days, each small detail feeding her mounting paranoia. Naomi's quieter demeanor, her occasional pauses to catch her breath, the way Charles's eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, it all added fuel to the fire burning in Eleanor's chest. One evening, as Naomi returned from the market with fresh produce, Eleanor intercepted her in the grand foyer. "Naomi," Eleanor began, her tone deceptively calm. "A word, please." Naomi hesitated, her hands clutching the heavy bag of groceries. "Of course, Mrs. Whitfield." Eleanor motioned for a passing maid to take the bag from Naomi's hands, then gestured toward the parlor. The two women entered, the tension between them palpable. Eleanor closed the door behind them and turned to face Naomi, her expression icy. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Eleanor asked, folding her arms across her chest. Naomi blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am." Eleanor's lips thinned, her patience fraying. "I've noticed changes. You've been more reserved, distracted, and I can't help but wonder if there's a reason for it." Naomi straightened, her hands clasped in front of her. "I assure you, Mrs. Whitfield, I'm fully committed to my duties." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes boring into Naomi's. "Don't play coy with me, Naomi. I'm not blind. Are you—" She paused, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Are you expecting?" Naomi froze, her breath catching. The room seemed to shrink around her as Eleanor's words hung in the air like a dagger. "I don't think that's an appropriate question," Naomi said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Appropriate? You think it's inappropriate for me to ask about something that could disrupt the harmony of this household?" Naomi met Eleanor's gaze, her calm resolve unwavering. "I don't believe my personal life affects my ability to perform my duties, ma'am." Eleanor's eyes flared with anger. "You don't get to decide that. This is my home, and I demand honesty." Naomi's silence only fueled Eleanor's frustration. The older woman took a step back, her expression hardening. "If you think you can hide something like this and still work under my roof, you're sorely mistaken," Eleanor said, her voice cold. "I will not tolerate deceit." Without another word, Eleanor turned and swept out of the room, leaving Naomi standing alone, her heart pounding in her chest. In the quiet of the parlor, Naomi steadied herself against the edge of a chair, her breath shallow. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Stand tall, Naomi. Even when the world tries to knock you down, you don't bow to it." She inhaled deeply, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let Eleanor's accusations break her. She had endured too much to let this moment define her. But as Naomi left the parlor and returned to her room, she couldn't shake the weight of Eleanor's words. The woman's suspicion was a storm brewing on the horizon, one that threatened to uproot everything Naomi had worked so hard to build. The Whitfield estate bustled with its usual mid-morning activity. Staff hurried through the halls, polishing silverware, arranging flowers, and preparing for an upcoming luncheon Eleanor had planned for her social circle. Naomi worked quietly in the kitchen, her hands steady as she arranged a platter of fruit. But the air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Eleanor entered the kitchen suddenly, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Her presence immediately silenced the room. Every staff member stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting nervously between Eleanor and Naomi. "Naomi," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I need to speak with you. Now." Naomi set down the tray she was holding, her expression calm but wary. Yes, Mrs. Whitfield? Eleanor's gaze was steely, her lips pressed into a thin line. Out here, in the foyer. Naomi followed Eleanor out of the kitchen, aware of the curious glances of her co-workers. As they entered the grand foyer, the sunlight streaming through the large windows seemed to amplify the tension between them. Eleanor turned to face Naomi, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I gave you a chance to be honest with me," she began, her voice low but charged. "And yet, you continue to insult my intelligence." "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am," Naomi replied, her voice steady. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You know exactly what I mean. Do you think I haven't noticed? Your pale complexion, your sudden bouts of fatigue, the way you cradle your stomach when you think no one's looking." Naomi's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. Eleanor's voice rose, echoing through the open space of the foyer. "Are you pregnant?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Naomi glanced around, noticing that several staff members had paused in their tasks, their eyes wide with shock and curiosity. "I don't believe this is an appropriate conversation, Mrs. Whitfield," Naomi said firmly. "Don't you dare dismiss me," Eleanor snapped, her face flushed with anger. "This is my house, and I have every right to know if one of my employees is hiding something that could disrupt the order of this household." Naomi stood her ground, her voice calm but resolute. "My personal life is not something I'm required to discuss, even as your employee." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and hollow. "You think you can hide behind your self-righteous dignity. Let me tell you something, Naomi. You're nothing but a servant here, and servants don't have the luxury of secrets." Naomi felt the sting of Eleanor's words, but she refused to let them break her. She straightened her posture, meeting Eleanor's gaze with quiet strength. "With all due respect, Mrs. Whitfield," Naomi said, her voice steady, "I have always done my job with care and integrity. I'm not ashamed of my circumstances, and I will not let anyone make me feel less than because of them." Eleanor's hands trembled with rage, her composure unraveling. "How dare you talk to me like that?" she hissed. "You think you're better than your place? That you can just waltz into my home and upend everything I've built?" Naomi's calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Eleanor further. The older woman took a step closer, her voice dripping with venom. "You've been nothing but a source of shame since the day you walked through these doors. And if you won't leave on your own, I'll make sure you're forced out." The room fell silent, the weight of Eleanor's threat sinking into the air like lead. Naomi inhaled deeply, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to cut so deeply. "I'll collect my things," Naomi said quietly. Eleanor sneered, satisfaction flashing across her face. "That's the first sensible thing you've said all day." Naomi packed her belongings in her small room, her hands trembling as she folded her few possessions into a worn suitcase. The photograph of her parents and grandmother lay on the bed, the last item she carefully placed inside. As she closed the suitcase, she paused, her fingers brushing over the frame. "Konse kong je chame fai that vong," she whispered, the familiar words grounding her in the midst of her heartbreak. In the hallway, a few of the other staff members lingered, their faces etched with pity and discomfort. Maria, the older maid who had been kind to Naomi, approached her hesitantly. "I'm sorry, Naomi," Maria said softly. "She's always been like this. But this time, it's worse." Naomi managed a small smile. "It's not your fault. I'll be fine." Maria hesitated before pressing a small envelope into Naomi's hand. "This is my address. If you need anything, please don't hesitate." Tears pricked Naomi's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you, Maria." As Naomi made her way to the back entrance, Charles stood in the doorway of his study, watching her. His face was pale, his expression torn between guilt and helplessness. "Naomi," he called softly. She turned, her eyes meeting his. For a moment the air between them was heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi's heart ached at the regret in his tone, but she simply nodded. "Take care, Mr. Whitfield." With that, she stepped out into the sunlight, leaving the Whitfield estate and the storm of emotions within it behind. The soft hum of life in the small Charleston neighborhood buzzed quietly on a Sunday afternoon. Naomi sat in the modest pews of the community church, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her, Gabriel, now 7 years old, fidgeted slightly, his feet not yet touching the ground. The service was nearly over, and Gabriel's restless energy betrayed his growing impatience. As the final hymn echoed through the sanctuary, the elderly Reverend Paul approached the pulpit. "Before we go, we have a special guest today," he said, his warm eyes scanning the congregation. "Mr. Sam Mitchell, a retired music teacher, has graciously offered to play for us." From the corner of the church, a man with silver-streaked hair and a kind smile approached the old piano. The instrument, weathered by time, stood in stark contrast to the man's confident stride. Sam sat down, his fingers brushing over the keys with a reverence that silenced the room. The first notes spilled out like a gentle cascade, filling the sanctuary with a melody both mournful and beautiful. Naomi glanced at Gabriel, whose wide eyes were glued to the piano. His small hands rested on the pew's edge, his body leaning forward as though drawn to the music by an invisible thread. Later that afternoon, while most of the congregation mingled outside the church, Gabriel wandered back inside. Naomi followed close behind, her brow furrowing when she saw him standing near the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. "Gabriel," she called softly, careful not to startle him. He turned, his expression guilty. "I just wanted to see how it works," he said, glancing back at the instrument. Before Naomi could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Let him try," Sam said, stepping into the room. Naomi stiffened slightly. "I don't want him to bother you, Mr. Mitchell." "It's no bother," Sam assured her, waving a hand. "A child curious about music is never a bother." He approached the piano and gestured for Gabriel to sit on the bench. Gabriel hesitated, looking to his mother for approval. Naomi nodded reluctantly, her heart swelling at her son's excitement. Sam leaned over and pressed a single key. "Go ahead, try it." Gabriel's small fingers pressed the same key, his face lighting up at the sound. Slowly, he began experimenting, tapping different notes and giggling at the unexpected melodies he created. Sam chuckled. "You've got good instincts, kid." Over the next few weeks, Sam began teaching Gabriel the basics of piano. Every Sunday after church, they would sit together at the old instrument, Sam's patient guidance drawing out Gabriel's natural talent. Naomi watched from the back pew, her heart swelling with pride as she saw her son flourish under Sam's mentorship. It was a gift she hadn't expected, one that brought a glimmer of hope to their lives. One afternoon, as Sam packed up his sheet music, he turned to Naomi. "Your boy has something special," he said, his voice earnest. Naomi smiled softly. "He's always been determined. Once he sets his mind to something, there's no stopping him." "He reminds me of someone I used to teach," Sam said, his eyes distant with memory. "That same spark, that same drive. Don't let it go to waste, Naomi. Encourage it, nurture it. He could go far." Naomi nodded, her gratitude evident in her expression. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for everything." Sam waved her off with a grin. "The pleasure's all mine. That boy has a way of bringing life back into things, even an old piano like that." Sam Mitchell's modest home sat at the edge of the neighborhood, its front porch adorned with pots of blooming flowers and a rocking chair that creaked with the rhythm of Charleston's breezes. Every Saturday afternoon, Gabriel would make his way there, clutching his beginner's piano book under one arm and a determination to learn in his heart. Inside, Sam's upright piano stood in the corner of the living room. Though its varnish had faded and its keys bore the marks of time, it sang beautifully under Sam's touch. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, the walls lined with photographs of Sam's students from years past. "All right, Gabriel," Sam said one afternoon, settling into the seat beside the boy. "Let's pick up where we left off. Show me that scale again." Gabriel's small hands hovered over the keys before confidently pressing down, the notes flowing smoothly. Sam nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "Now, let's try adding a little rhythm. Music isn't just about playing the right notes, it's about feeling them." Gabriel furrowed his brow in concentration, his fingers following Sam's lead. Slowly but surely, the scale transformed into a simple melody, its rhythm carrying the seeds of something greater. Sam wasn't just teaching Gabriel to play the piano, he was teaching him patience, discipline, and the importance of expression. "Music is a conversation, Gabriel," Sam said during one lesson. "You're telling a story every time you play. It's not just about how it sounds, it's about how it feels." Gabriel nodded, soaking in every word. He began to approach the piano not just as an instrument, but as a vessel for his emotions. When he was frustrated, he poured that energy into his practice. When he was joyful, the melodies seemed to dance under his fingers. One afternoon, after a particularly good session, Sam leaned back and looked at Gabriel thoughtfully. "You know, when I was your age, I had a teacher who told me something I've never forgotten," he said. Gabriel looked up, curious. "What did they say?" "They said, 'The best music doesn't come from your hands, it comes from your heart.'" Sam placed a hand over his chest. "If you play from here, Gabriel, people will listen. No matter who they are or where they come from, they'll feel it." Gabriel nodded solemnly, the weight of Sam's words settling deep within him. Naomi often lingered near the porch during Gabriel's lessons, listening to the music drifting through the open window. Each note filled her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as they walked home together, Gabriel clutched Naomi's hand tightly. "Mama," he said, looking up at her, "do you think I could be as good as Mr. Mitchell someday?" Naomi smiled down at him, her heart swelling with pride. "I think you can be as good as you want to be, Gabriel. You just have to keep working hard." "I will," Gabriel said earnestly. "I promise." Naomi stopped walking for a moment, crouching down to look her son in the eyes. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "No matter what. Always remember that." Gabriel beamed, his young face lighting up with determination. One Saturday, Sam surprised Gabriel with a gift, a stack of old sheet music, carefully preserved despite their age. "These belonged to one of my first students," Sam said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I think it's time they found a new home." Gabriel's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages, his excitement barely contained. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell." "Don't thank me," Sam said with a chuckle. "Just promise me you'll keep playing. And when you're ready, we'll tackle one of these pieces together." Gabriel nodded eagerly, already imagining the melodies he would bring to life. As Gabriel's skills grew, Reverend Paul suggested that he play during an upcoming church service. At first, Gabriel was nervous. The thought of performing in front of the entire congregation made his hands shake. "What if I mess up?" he asked Sam during their lesson. Sam placed a reassuring hand on Gabriel's shoulder. "Everyone makes mistakes, Gabriel. What matters is how you recover. Besides, music isn't about being perfect. It's about sharing something honest." On the day of the performance, Naomi sat in the front pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Gabriel took his place at the piano, her heart swelled with equal parts pride and nervousness. As Gabriel began to play, the sanctuary filled with a melody that was both tender and powerful. Each note resonated with emotion, telling a story far beyond his years. By the time he finished, the congregation erupted into applause, their faces glowing with admiration. Naomi wiped away tears, her chest tight with gratitude. Gabriel glanced at her, his smile bright with the joy of accomplishment. The once grand Whitfield estate, nestled among the sprawling oaks of Charleston, now seemed to echo with a hollow emptiness. The laughter and liveliness that had once filled its rooms were gone, replaced by a strained silence. The weight of secrets, regrets, and unspoken truths had sunk its roots deep into the house, fracturing the lives of those within. Charles Whitfield sat at his desk in the study, his pen poised over a sheet of fine stationery. The once proud businessman now appeared a shadow of himself, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his guilt. Before him lay the beginnings of a letter, one he had rewritten countless times, yet never completed. He stared at the words, his hand trembling slightly as he thought of Naomi and Gabriel. The boy he had never been able to acknowledge, the woman he had failed to protect. Their faces haunted him, not with resentment, but with the quiet dignity they had shown even in the face of cruelty. He dipped the pen into the inkwell and began again, his thoughts spilling onto the page. There are moments in life when silence becomes unbearable, when the truths we hide within ourselves demand to be spoken, not to seek forgiveness, but to find peace. This is one of those moments for me. From the day we married, I had dreams for us, dreams of a family, of a home filled with love and laughter. But somewhere along the way, those dreams slipped away, replaced by the cold pursuit of appearances and obligations. I see now that I allowed my own fears and weaknesses to build walls between us, walls I was too cowardly to break down. And then there was Naomi. Charles paused, the weight of her name on the page pressing against his chest. He could almost hear Eleanor's sharp intake of breath as she read it, but he knew he had to continue. Naomi came into our lives as an employee, but she became more than that. She became a reminder of everything I had lost: kindness, authenticity, and the ability to truly connect. Her resilience, even in the face of your disdain and my silence, was a reflection of a strength I admired, but lacked. And Gabriel. Though I have no right to claim him, I see in him the hope and goodness I once dreamed our family would have. He is the son I never deserved, but am grateful exists in this world. To you, Eleanor, I owe the greatest apology, not just for Naomi, but for every time I allowed the distance between us to grow. For every moment I let your bitterness fester without offering the comfort you deserved. I failed you as a husband, and I failed myself as a man. Charles leaned back in his chair, exhaling shakily. His eyes scanned the words, each one feeling like a confession to a crime he could never undo. But there was more to say. He dipped the pen again and continued. I don't know if you will ever forgive me, Eleanor, or if you should. But I hope this letter helps you understand that my mistakes were never born of malice, only fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of facing the truth. I hope, in the quiet moments of reflection, you find the courage to look beyond the anger and see what truly matters. This house, this estate, they mean nothing without love, without connection. And I believe you still have the capacity to find that. For what it's worth, I am sorry. For everything. Charles signed the letter with a heavy heart, folding it carefully and placing it in an envelope. He hesitated before sealing it, knowing that once he delivered it, there would be no turning back. The letter sat on Eleanor's vanity for 2 days before she opened it. Her curiosity had burned since Charles handed it to her, his expression solemn, but pride and resentment kept her from reading it immediately. On the third night, unable to sleep, she sat before the vanity, the dim light of the room casting shadows across her tired face. She picked up the envelope, turning it over in her hands before carefully breaking the seal. As she read, her breath hitched. The words pierced through the armor she had built around herself, each line stripping away her defenses. By the time she reached the end, her hands trembled and tears blurred her vision. Eleanor stared at her reflection in the mirror, her mind replaying Charles's words. She saw not the poised, immaculate woman she projected to the world, but someone far more fragile. She had spent years cloaking herself in bitterness, using it as a shield against the pain of her own insecurities. The failure to have children, the growing distance between her and Charles, the loneliness that had crept into her life, all of it had been channeled into a rigid need for control. Her thoughts turned to Naomi, the young woman she had treated with such cruelty. Eleanor had always justified her actions as necessary to maintain order, but now, in the quiet of her room, she saw them for what they truly were: the actions of a woman desperate to assert power where she felt powerless. And Gabriel, the boy she had barely thought of until now, except as a source of scandal. Charles's words about him lingered in her mind. "He is the son I never deserved, but am grateful exists in this world." Eleanor's chest tightened. Could it be true? Could the boy she had seen only as a threat be the key to something she had longed for but could never admit? A connection, a legacy, a chance at redemption. The Whitfield estate stood as it always had, grand and imposing, but its foundations were beginning to crack. Eleanor could feel it in every creak of the floorboards, every echo of her own footsteps in the vast, empty halls. She thought of Charles, of the guilt he carried, and the truth he had finally laid bare. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her own loneliness, her own part in the chasm that had formed between them. Sitting alone in the silence of her room, Eleanor folded the letter and placed it back on the vanity. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar: hope. The grand concert hall was a sea of light and opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering reflections on the audience below, dressed in their finest attire, their murmurs blending into a low hum of anticipation. It was the kind of event Eleanor Whitfield rarely missed: prestigious, filled with the right kind of people, and offering the perfect opportunity to display her cultivated elegance. But tonight, Eleanor's focus was different. She sat stiffly in her seat, scanning the program in her hand. It listed the performers, many of whom she didn't recognize, until her eyes stopped at one name: Gabriel Ellis. Backstage, Gabriel stood by the piano, his fingers brushing the keys lightly as he steadied his breath. Now 17, he had grown into a young man with a quiet confidence, his natural talent honed by years of practice and guidance. His music teacher, Sam Mitchell, stood nearby, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Gabriel," Sam said. "Play from your heart. They'll feel it." Gabriel nodded, drawing strength from the words. As his name was announced, he stepped onto the stage, the applause washing over him like a wave. He sat at the grand piano, the instrument gleaming under the spotlight. The hall fell silent as he began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate, like the opening of a story. As the melody grew, so did the intensity, the music weaving a tapestry of emotion: joy, sorrow, resilience. Gabriel's fingers danced across the keys, each movement precise yet fluid, as though the piano was an extension of his very soul. Eleanor watched, her breath caught in her throat. There was something familiar in the way he held himself, the shape of his jaw, the determination in his eyes. It struck her— like a bolt of lightning. Gabriel looked like Charles. The resemblance was undeniable, and with each passing moment, the realization burrowed deeper into her chest. After the performance, the audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. Gabriel stood, bowing gracefully before exiting the stage. Eleanor could barely think. Her mind raced as she made her way backstage, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. She found Naomi near the dressing rooms, standing proudly as she waited for Gabriel. "Naomi," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. Naomi turned slowly, her expression calm but guarded. "Mrs. Whitfield," she replied. Eleanor's gaze bore into her. "He's Charles's son, isn't he?" Naomi didn't flinch. "Yes." The single word hung between them, heavy with truth. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Do you have any idea what this could do to our family, to our reputation? This cannot get out, Naomi. For the sake of everyone involved, it must stay between us." Naomi's eyes hardened. "For the sake of everyone involved? Or just for you?" Eleanor bristled. "Think about Gabriel. The scandal would follow him for the rest of his life. He doesn't need that kind of burden." Naomi's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Gabriel doesn't need your name or your wealth. He's been raised to stand on his own. He's learned to fight for himself, to value who he is, not where he came from." Eleanor hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm asking you to protect him." Naomi's eyes softened, but her resolve didn't waver. Protecting him means letting him be who he is, not hiding him in the shadows of your fears. The following Sunday, the small church was packed with members of the community, their voices rising in song as the service began. Naomi sat in her usual pew, Gabriel by her side. His performance had become the talk of the neighborhood, his talent celebrated by all who knew him. Eleanor entered quietly, drawing surprised glances from the congregation. She rarely attended, preferring to maintain her distance from the community. But today, she moved with purpose, clutching a folded letter in her hand. As Reverend Paul finished his sermon, Eleanor stood, her presence commanding attention. "I have something to say," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. The room fell silent as she unfolded the letter. "This is a letter from my husband, Charles Whitfield. It's a letter I've carried with me for some time, and I believe it's time for the truth to be spoken." Her eyes swept the room, landing on Naomi and Gabriel. In this letter, Charles admits his failings as a husband and a man. He speaks of a woman who showed him kindness when he felt lost, and a son who embodies everything he wished he could be. That son is Gabriel Ellis. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Naomi's hand instinctively reached for Gabriel's, gripping it tightly. Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "I spent years blinded by my own pride, my own need for control. But I see now that the truth is more important than any reputation. Gabriel is not just Charles's son, he is a part of this community, a part of something greater than any of us." Tears shimmered in Eleanor's eyes as she turned to Naomi. "I'm sorry. For everything." Naomi's throat tightened, but she nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. As the congregation filed out, murmurs of shock and support filled the air. Eleanor lingered, watching as Gabriel shook hands with Reverend Paul and several others, his smile bright and genuine. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something shift within her. The weight of her bitterness began to lift, replaced by the faintest glimmer of hope. Naomi approached her, Gabriel at her side. "Thank you," Naomi said simply. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on Gabriel. "You have a remarkable son, Naomi. I hope he can forgive me one day." Gabriel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't about the past," he said. "It's about what we do moving forward." Eleanor smiled faintly, her heart heavy but full. "Then I'll do my best." The Charleston community gathered at the town square, the golden hues of the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the scene. It was a special day, one that had drawn curious onlookers, long-time residents, and those who had followed Gabriel Ellis's journey from the very beginning. Eleanor Whitfield stood on the small stage, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. The crowd's murmurs quieted, their attention fixed on the woman who had long been a symbol of wealth and power, now standing before them with an air of humility. "I've spent most of my life clinging to an image of perfection," Eleanor began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I thought that by maintaining control, by preserving appearances, I could create a life of value. But in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters: love, kindness, and the courage to admit when you're wrong." Her eyes swept over the crowd, landing on Naomi and Gabriel, who stood together near the front. "Naomi," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "I wronged you in so many ways. I let my fear and pride blind me to the incredible person you are. You showed resilience and grace when I showed only cruelty. For that, I am deeply sorry." Naomi's expression softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. Eleanor turned to Gabriel. "And to you, Gabriel. You are everything Charles hoped to be and more. Your talent, your heart, your determination, they inspire everyone who meets you, including me. I hope you can forgive me for the mistakes I've made." Gabriel stepped forward, his voice calm but strong. "Forgiveness is about moving forward, Mrs. Whitfield. And I believe that's what we should all do, from this moment on." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to the power of reconciliation and hope. As the sun dipped lower, Gabriel took his place at the piano set up on the stage. The crowd hushed once more, anticipation thick in the air. "This song," Gabriel began, his voice carrying a quiet strength, "is not just about me. It's about all of us. Music is a bridge. It connects us, helps us understand one another, and reminds us that we're not so different after all." His fingers began to move across the keys, the melody flowing like a gentle river. The notes were tender, filled with emotion, telling a story of pain, resilience, and ultimately, hope. As the final chord echoed into the evening, the audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Tears streamed down faces, and smiles spread like ripples across the crowd. Gabriel stood, bowing deeply before stepping away from the piano. In the months and years that followed, Gabriel's music would travel far beyond Charleston. He became a celebrated artist, using his platform to share messages of love, forgiveness, and unity. His performances were not just concerts, but experiences that brought people together, bridging divides with the universal language of music. Eleanor spent her remaining years quietly but meaningfully. She supported local charities, attended Gabriel's performances, and grew close to Naomi, who welcomed her into their lives with grace. The once hollow estate became a place of warmth and connection, reflecting the transformation of its mistress. Eleanor passed away peacefully, her final years filled with gratitude and healing. At her funeral, Gabriel played a piece he had composed in her honor, a melody that spoke of second chances and the beauty of change. Naomi stood beside him, her heart full, as she watched her son carry forward a legacy not of wealth or status, but of compassion and humanity. This story reminds us that no matter how broken we may feel, it is never too late to seek forgiveness and rebuild. Gabriel's journey teaches us that resilience and love can overcome even the deepest divisions, and Eleanor's transformation proves that change is possible, even for those who seem furthest from it. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how Gabriel's journey inspired you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to discover more stories like this, where hope, love, and redemption take center stage. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.